The lock on the cellar door was secured from the outside with a padlock I had never seen before. I stood there in my nephew's backyard, holding a flashlight in 72-degree weather, staring at a door that had no business being locked at all. My brother's old woodworking shop was down there. He had built half the furniture in his house in that basement. He had never locked it a day in his life. I called out his name. Nothing. Then I heard it, a slow, rhythmic scraping sound coming from below, like something metal dragging across concrete. I grabbed the padlock and pulled. It held. I grabbed it again and pulled harder. It held again. I picked up a cinder block from the garden border and I swung it. Once, twice. On the third swing, the hasp tore free from the rotting wood frame and the door swung open and a smell came up from below that I will never forget for as long as I live. I had to grip the railing to keep from falling down the stairs. 6 weeks earlier, my brother had stopped answering my calls. That was not unusual for him. After his accident 3 years ago, he went through long stretches where he did not want to talk to anyone. His right leg had been crushed in a job site collapse when he was 58 years old. He lost the ability to work, lost most of his mobility, and for a while I thought he was going to lose the will to keep going entirely. I drove out to see him every few months. We talked on the phone every Sunday. That was our routine. But when I called him on a Sunday in early October, no one answered. I figured he was sleeping. I called again on Tuesday. Nothing. I called again on Thursday, and a different voice answered a young woman's voice, and she told me my brother was resting and could not come to the phone. That was my nephew's wife. I had only met her twice. Once at the wedding 3 years ago, which my brother attended in a wheelchair, and once at Thanksgiving the following year when things were still polite between everyone. She was pleasant enough both times. Nothing about her struck me as unusual. She was 31 years old, worked in healthcare administration, laughed easily at dinner. My nephew had met her during the worst of my brother's recovery, and she had helped him navigate the insurance paperwork. My brother liked her. He told me she was sharp. I asked her if everything was okay. She said yes, everything was fine. My brother had just been having some difficult days with his pain levels and was sleeping more than usual. I told her to have him call me when he was feeling up to it. He never called. 2 weeks later, I tried again. This time, the phone rang 12 times with no answer. I tried my nephew's cell phone, straight to voicemail. I left a message. I waited 4 days and left another one. I wrote an email to both of them with my brother's name in the subject line and a simple question. Please just let me know he is okay. No response. By the end of the 5th week, I had started keeping a log. Every call, every text, every email. I wrote down the date and time and what happened. Old habit from my years in construction management. You document everything because eventually someone will ask you what happened and when, and you want to have an answer. On the 38th day since my last real conversation with my brother, I got into my truck and I drove 4 hours east to a small town in Indiana where my brother had lived for the last 11 years. I did not call ahead. I want to be honest about that. Part of me was embarrassed by how worried I had become. Part of me thought I was being dramatic, that I would knock on the door and my brother would answer it himself, looking annoyed that I had driven 4 hours to check on him, and we would have a beer and laugh about it. Part of me was afraid of what I might find. The other part of me, the part that had known my brother for 61 years, knew something was wrong. I pulled up to the house around 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday. My nephew's car was not in the driveway. A newer model SUV I did not recognize was parked on the street. The blinds on the front windows were drawn closed. I knocked on the front door. My nephew's wife answered after a long pause. She was wearing scrubs, and her hair was pulled back tight, and the smile she gave me did not reach her eyes. She said she was surprised to see me. She said my nephew was at work. She said my brother was resting upstairs. I told her I had driven 4 hours and I would like to see him. She said he really did not like being woken up, that his sleep schedule was very fragile right now. I said I would sit quietly at the foot of his bed if I had to. I was not leaving without seeing him. Something moved across her face, something quick and difficult to name. Then she smiled again and said, of course, she understood. Family was important. Let me just check on him first. She went upstairs. I heard muffled voices. Then she came back down and said he was awake now and I could go up. My brother was sitting up in bed. He looked like a photograph of himself taken after a long illness. He had lost a significant amount of weight. His eyes were dull in a way I had not seen since the worst months after his accident. He smiled when he saw me, but it was a slow smile, the kind that takes effort. I sat down in the chair next to his bed and I took his hand and I asked him how he was really doing. He said fine. He said he had been tired. He said the pain had been bad lately. I asked him why he had not called me. He said he had been meaning to. He said he was sorry. He said time got away from him. Something about the way he said it made my chest feel tight. My brother was not a man who lost track of time. He was not a man who let things slide. Even after the accident, even at his lowest, he would call me every Sunday without fail because he said routine was the only thing keeping him together. I looked at his phone on the nightstand. The screen was cracked and dark. I asked him if his phone was working. He glanced toward the bedroom door and then back at me. Just a glance. Less than a second. But I caught it. He said the battery had been giving him trouble. I picked up the phone. Dead. I asked him where his charger was. He paused a beat too long before he said he was not sure. It might be downstairs somewhere. I plugged the phone into my own charger, which I had in my pocket. While we waited for it to power on, I told him about small things. My garden, a fishing trip I had been planning, my wife's new job. He listened and nodded, and the tension in his shoulders slowly came down a few degrees. When his phone turned on, 37 missed calls appeared on the screen. Most of them were from me. Several were from his neighbor down the street, a man named Gerald, who had been my brother's closest friend for 8 years. There were also 4 calls from a number I did not recognize with a Dayton, Ohio area code. My brother looked at the screen and his jaw tightened. I asked him who the Ohio number was. He said he did not know. I excused myself to use the bathroom. Instead of going to the bathroom, I went downstairs. My nephew's wife was in the kitchen on her phone, speaking quietly. She looked up when I walked in and ended the call. I told her I was just getting a glass of water. I looked around the kitchen while I ran the tap. A stack of mail on the counter, mostly unopened. I caught a glimpse of a letterhead I recognized before she stepped between me and the counter. It was from my brother's disability insurance carrier. I looked at her directly and I asked her if my brother's disability checks were being deposited properly. She said, of course, everything was handled automatically. I asked her who had access to his accounts. She said my nephew helped manage things since my brother had trouble getting around. I said that made sense. But it did not make sense. My brother had managed his own finances through a leg injury, 3 surgeries, and 18 months of physical therapy without asking anyone for help. He was proud of that. He had told me so. I went back upstairs. I sat with my brother for another hour. When his wife's footsteps moved away from the bottom of the stairs, I leaned close to him and I asked him quietly if everything was really okay. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he was just tired. He said he was handling it. I asked him what he was handling. He did not answer. I told him I was going to step out to my truck to get something, and I would be right back. I asked him if he needed anything while I was outside. He said no. Then very quietly, without looking up from the blanket, he said I should check the backyard. I thought I had misheard him. I asked him to repeat it. He kept his eyes down. His voice was barely a sound. He said to check the backyard workshop. I did not ask any more questions. I went downstairs and told my nephew's wife I had forgotten something in my truck and I would be right in. She nodded and went back to her phone call. I walked to my truck. I sat there for 30 seconds. Then I walked around the side of the house to the backyard. The yard was neat. The garden border was maintained. 2 folding chairs sat near the back fence. The workshop door at the bottom of the cellar stairs was at the far end of the yard, half covered by the shadow of the back fence. That was when I saw the padlock, and that was when I heard the scraping. I will not describe in detail what I found at the bottom of those stairs. I will say that I had to sit down on the second step because my legs gave out beneath me. I will say that I called 911 before I had fully processed what I was seeing. I will say that the responding officers, 2 of them, both stood in silence for a moment when they came down behind me. The man in that basement was not a stranger. He was 61 years old, and he had taught himself woodworking from library books after his accident, because he said he needed to build things to feel like himself again. He had made a dining table for his son's house with his own hands. He had made a jewelry box for my wife's birthday. He had shown me calluses on his palms from sanding and said he was proud of those calluses because they meant he was still useful. He was sitting on a cot in the corner of the basement with a chain secured around his left ankle. The chain was bolted to the wall. It gave him enough range to reach a small bathroom in the back corner and a folding table with a camping cooler on it. The cooler had water bottles in it and some packaged food. Enough to keep him alive. Not enough to keep him well. He had been down there for 22 days. He looked up when I came down the stairs, and the expression on his face was something I do not have words for. It was relief and humiliation at the same time. And I want you to understand that my brother was not a man who felt humiliation easily. He had rebuilt himself from nothing after that accident. He had done it without complaint and without asking for help from anyone. Seeing that look on his face was the hardest thing I have ever witnessed in my life. I went to him and I held on to him and I told him I was there and it was over. He said he knew I would come. He said he had been scraping the chain against the floor every afternoon at the same time, hoping someone outside would hear it. The officers called for an ambulance. I went upstairs and found my nephew's wife in the kitchen. She was already on her phone. When she saw my face, she stopped speaking mid-sentence. I told her to put the phone down. She said I did not understand the full situation. I told her to put the phone down again. She put it down. I asked her where my nephew was. She said at work. I asked her what kind of work kept a man away from home for 6 weeks while his disabled father was chained in the basement. She looked at the front door. I stepped between her and the door. I was 63 years old, and I had spent 30 years pouring concrete and framing houses, and I was not a small man, and I told her she was going to stay right where she was until the police came inside. She stayed. What followed took weeks to fully understand. I will try to give you the important parts. 3 years earlier, when my brother was recovering from his second surgery, my nephew had volunteered to manage his finances. My brother, who was on significant pain medication at the time, had signed a power of attorney that gave my nephew full access to his accounts. My brother told me later he had thought it was a temporary arrangement, just while he was recovering. He had not understood the scope of what he had signed. Over the following 2 years, my nephew and his wife had transferred funds from my brother's disability payments into a joint account they controlled. They had also sold a piece of property my father had left to both me and my brother, a small parcel of land in Kentucky that had been in our family for 40 years without my brother's knowledge or consent. The sale had generated a little over $300,000. My name was not on the deed by our father's arrangement, only my brother's, which made it technically possible for someone with power of attorney to act on it. They had also taken out a loan in my brother's name using his house as collateral. By the time investigators went through the accounts, my brother's net worth had been reduced from roughly $420,000 to less than $18,000. His house had a lien against it. He did not know. My nephew's wife had been the architect of most of it. She worked in healthcare administration and understood exactly how to navigate financial documents and medical power of attorney language. She had carefully kept enough money in my brother's visible accounts to avoid raising flags, moving larger amounts gradually over time. She had researched exactly how long a person could survive on minimal food and water. She had calculated that 6 weeks would be enough time to complete the final transfers before my brother, weakened and disoriented, might be persuaded to sign additional documents, or might simply be found unresponsive, at which point they intended to claim he had taken a fall. When the investigators told me that part, I had to leave the room for a few minutes. My nephew had not originated the plan. That became clear early in the investigation. He had gone along with it, which was its own form of evil, but the scheme had been designed by his wife. When investigators interviewed him separately, he broke down almost immediately. He said he had not known about the chain. He said he had thought his father was being kept in the basement temporarily while they finished some paperwork, that his wife said it was necessary for a short time, that she had assured him his father was fine. The investigators did not find that convincing. Neither did the prosecutor. Both of them were charged. The charges included elder abuse, unlawful imprisonment, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and fraud. The property sale was subject to a separate civil action. Their attorney argued that my nephew had been manipulated by his wife, which may have been partially true, but my brother spent 22 days chained to a wall, and the law does not issue partial credit for partial culpability. My nephew's wife received 11 years. My nephew received 6. My brother sat in the courtroom for the sentencing, and he did not say anything afterward for a long time. We drove to a diner outside of town and sat in a booth, and he drank coffee, and I did not push him to talk. Finally, he said he kept trying to understand where the line was, the moment his son had crossed from a person into something else. He said he had replayed every conversation they'd had over the past 3 years, and he could not find it. He said that was the part that was going to take the longest to make peace with. I told him I did not think you were supposed to make peace with something like that. I told him I thought you just learned to carry it differently over time. He nodded and drank his coffee. He said he wished he had told me sooner what was happening. I asked him why he had not. He looked out the window for a while. Then he said he was ashamed. He said he had signed those papers without reading them carefully enough. He said he had trusted the wrong person and he had been too proud to admit that something was wrong until it was almost too late. He said every time he had thought about calling me from that basement, he had stopped himself because he did not want me to see him like that. I told him that was the most ridiculous thing I had ever heard in 63 years, and I had heard some genuinely ridiculous things. He almost smiled. I told him that calling me was the one thing he was always allowed to do under any circumstances for the rest of his life. I told him that was not optional. He said okay. I told him I meant it. He said he knew I meant it, and he was sorry. My brother lives with me now. We converted the back room of my house into a proper, accessible bedroom and put in a walk-in shower. My wife, who has been married to me long enough to understand that I come with a brother attached, did most of the decorating. She put his old woodworking tools on the wall as display pieces because he was not yet strong enough to use them regularly, and she said looking at them was better than not looking at them. He is physically recovering. The doctors say his long-term health should be okay, that 22 days, while serious, did not cause permanent organ damage. His spirits go up and down. Some mornings I come into the kitchen and he is sitting at the table with coffee and he looks almost like himself. Some mornings he is very quiet, and the quiet is a different kind. The kind that has a weight to it. I give him those mornings. I pour my coffee, and I sit across from him, and I do not ask him to be anywhere other than where he is. What I want to tell you, the thing I have been turning over in my mind since the day I broke that padlock off the cellar door, is this. I almost did not go. I am serious about that. I almost convinced myself that I was being dramatic, that I was overreacting, that the explanation was something simple. He was tired. He was in pain. He needed space. And showing up unannounced was the kind of thing that made a man in his 60s look like he could not let his younger brother live his own life. I had that conversation with myself 4 separate times over those 6 weeks. I talked myself out of driving down there 4 times. The 5th time I stopped talking and I drove. I do not say this to congratulate myself. I say it because if you are watching this and something in it reminds you of someone in your own life, someone you have been meaning to check on, someone whose calls you have been getting routed to a third party, someone who seems different when you finally do reach them, I want you to trust that feeling. Not because you owe them a rescue, but because sometimes the difference between someone being found and someone not being found is one person who decides that showing up matters more than looking foolish. My brother told me later that in the last few days before I arrived, he had started to lose track of time. He said the days had started to blur together, and he was having trouble remembering what day it was. He said he had heard me pull up. He had heard my voice at the front door. He had pressed his ear against the ceiling of that basement and listened to my footsteps move across the floor above him, and he had not been able to make himself call out because he was afraid of what would happen if he called out, and I was sent away before he could be heard. He said when I walked back around the house to the backyard and he heard my footsteps on the grass above the cellar door, he picked up a piece of chain and dragged it across the concrete floor and hoped that was all he had left by then. That scraping sound. That hope that someone who knew him well enough to listen would be standing close enough to hear it. I heard it. I want to believe you would hear it too. If someone in your life has gone quiet in a way that does not feel right, please do not wait for a more convenient time to check on them. Drive the 4 hours. Knock on the door. Be willing to look foolish. The people who love us are sometimes in rooms we do not know exist, hoping we are still close enough to hear them. My brother is in the kitchen right now, drinking his 3rd cup of coffee, which his doctor has told him is one too many, and arguing that a man who has been through what he has been through has earned the right to an extra cup. He is not wrong. I let him have it.